The narrative commences with an examination of the Perserad, the eldest, most enigmatic, and malevolent family of alchemists. Many chemical experiments were conducted in their pursuit of understanding the universe. These insane alchemists instigated a multitude of biochemical catastrophes throughout the world. Dragons that spit venom, 20-meter creatures that were pumped full of anabolic substances, and even mosquitoes that sucked out brains. Nevertheless, the family experienced a decline 300 years ago for an unknown reason. Nevertheless, Izzo Perserad, the most gifted descendant of the family, is also regarded as the most accomplished alchemist of the century. Additionally, he pledges to develop biochemical weapons that will surpass the powers of the gods and restore the family's prestige. He extends his arms, proclaiming that the final calamity is imminent, a development that he has prepared for over 400 days. He instructs Dirty Rat to initiate the process, but he advises him to maintain the purification area at 70%. Cheese, the large rodent, responds by instructing him to cease using the term Dirty Rat. Subsequently, he declares that the body temperature is 25 DU4 and the fluids are at 99%. Stable signals were observed. He complies with Izzo's directive to incorporate 52 grams of black sulfur. Then, he is subjected to 160 grams of white mercury, and he submits. He proceeds to request 366 grams of yellow salt, and the individual complies. Nevertheless, stability decreases to 72% at that time. Izzo promptly instructs the tank to be depressurized, all fluids to be drained, and the tank to be unsealed in anticipation of the unveiling. The safety measures are disabled by the rodent, who then declares that the creation tank is prepared. The purple symbol on the device begins to illuminate, and Izzo is overjoyed, as he has finally developed the most lethal chemical weapon the world has ever encountered. He contemplates the magnificent representation of the catastrophe that he is about to unleash. He declares that he will embark on the conquest of the world by spreading his arms and taking a stride forward in his terrible form. Nevertheless, he observes the foot and the pulse, and he quickly understands that the creature that was born is not a monster. Izzo is taken aback and inquires as to what this object is. He claims that he must observe it in person, due to the rat's warning that it is hazardous. However, he continues to approach, instructing him to cease speaking. Standing in front of the lady, he perceives it as peculiar. It is possible that the calamity was using a form of impersonation in which it assumed the appearance of a woman. That would account for the two enormous spheres, which are undoubtedly energy storage bags that are essential for the calamity's operation. He extends his hand to make contact, stating that he must conduct a test. He is certain, based on the texture and suppleness, that creature was an ordinary individual. He is uncertain as to where the angelic arm of extinction that he had possessed disappeared, or the jade eye of the mournful empress that he had implanted. In addition, he had implanted a type 1 indefatigable heart. However, he was unable to detect any blood movement. Suddenly, an object reveals its eyes, prompting the rodent to exercise caution. Izzo is on the brink of recognizing a truth, but it is too late. The entity launches an attack, securing him to the ground. Interestingly, she is simply exhaling and expressing her disappointment. However, it appears that he will be obligated to continue the Perseid legacy. He even begins to contemplate the inscription on his tombstone. The prodigy alchemist who was not killed by the city's heroes, but rather by his own experiments. Izzo promptly commands him to assist, threatening to insert a multitude of worms into his cheese if he fails to do so. The rodent becomes enraged, asserting that he is being excessively cruel. Nevertheless, the red liquid that had poured was merely the remains of a flaming slug. Izzo asserts that he, the most accomplished alchemist, would not be slain by his own creations. He reminds Cheese that he had instructed him to incorporate the soul extraction liquid in order to prevent this creature from inflicting harm on him. Cheese attempts to recall the event, but he insists that he has no recollection of doing so. That is the moment when he remembers a day when Izzo brought the purported liquid and instructed him to cease consuming it and incorporate it into the production. Cheese had opened it, enjoyed the aroma, and subsequently opted to incorporate it into his own beverage. He is now certain that everything is condemned in the present. Izzo returns to the culminating calamity, declaring that he is her master and commanding her to comply. She abruptly ascends. He inquires as to why she is approaching so closely, and the girl, as if in response, reaches out and grips him. The boy's body is solely detonated by a series of lethal blows. He pushes her away, perplexed, as he spirals into pandemonium. He flees, screaming that the filthy rodent exposed him and that he now requires the purification spray. The damsel is once again ensnared when he presses the button. She persists in striking the glass, yet she appears incapable of communicating. In the interim, Izzo is administering purification medication to himself. At that instant, he recalls an additional familiar face. He initiates the process of reviewing the files, prompting Cheese to inquire about the situation. Then, he locates records regarding the original cadaver of Experiment 2252. He is certain that the woman from that time is the same. Cheese abruptly recalls the girl they discovered, stating that she was devoid of arms and legs. Nevertheless, he remembers that her hair was purple at that time. Consequently, why is it now yellow? Izzo responds that this is the least of their concerns. Initially, they must comprehend this alteration in their personality. Subsequently, we observe the Golden City's Queen's Bank from 1 year ago. Numerous individuals were conducting their daily routines in a tranquil manner. However, a chemical device had been concealed in the vicinity. The gas began to disperse throughout the entire area when the timer reached 0. Meanwhile, Izzo and Cheese were in the restroom, casually relieving themselves. The rat expresses his conviction that the dragon toxin has already been discharged. Izzo retrieves a mask and a weapon from his luggage, and it is now time to commence. As the two enter the bank, everyone had collapsed onto the floor. An officer instructed them to remain in place, stating that the bank's proprietor was en route. Nevertheless, the individual was transformed into a slime after Izzo discharged a shot from his diminutive firearm. He even stated that the object had become significantly more adorable. Cheese halted in front of a mother and child at that instant and declared that he had discovered his favorite thing. The mother begged him not to murder her son in desperation, but Cheese did something far more heinous. He sinned by stealing the child's lollipop and walked away, claiming that it was a nice one. Consequently, they secured the entire facility and initiated the process of melting down the bank. The vault containing the cash was accessed after a bomb was installed and the entire structure detonated. The scoundrel was overjoyed that everything had gone smoothly. Subsequently, they were strolling back to their residence, their voices resonating with joy. Izzo referred to himself as the genius alchemist of crime, asserting that there was no more fitting moniker for him. In the interim, Cheese expressed his desire to attend the bar and commemorate the evening. However, our boy declined, stating that he had previously been compelled to provide financial assistance to the unsightly women. Consequently, he declined. The final calamity was to be the focus of all of this. Upon completion of this endeavor, the entire city would serve as their playground. Cheese acknowledged that it was more logical in light of the opportunities. They exchanged glances and mutually consented that they would proceed to the mayor's residence and dance to the music. They shared a chuckle, joking that they shared the same thoughts. However, they were abruptly interrupted by a loud noise. They promptly sank into a crouch, and Cheese inferred that an individual was following them. However, Izzo was certain that the individual had not approached them from such a close distance. A man named Homunculus, who was employed at the city security office, was observed emitting smoke from his device. He was pursuing a girl who was utterly exhausted and collapsed on the ground. Cheese ridiculed the notion that they were being undervalued. This individual was pursuing an individual who had recently committed a bank robbery. The brute acknowledged that one unit from that organization was capable of killing 5 of his detectives. However, his principal objective was to obtain the target list that the Hellhounds had dispatched to eradicate. Perhaps he would spare her life if she cooperated. He then chuckled, joking that he had forgotten that all members of her unit had their vocal cords severed, rendering them unable to communicate with anyone. She abruptly reached for an object on her back, but her progress was abruptly halted. Homunculus sneered, referring to her as a very naughty girl for attempting to do something in this situation. At that moment, he observed her reaching for a teddy bear and began to question whether she truly appreciated it. At that moment, she grasped his pants and emitted a series of distorted noises. However, he promptly struck her on the back of the head and threw her to the ground. He sneered as he stepped on the unfortunate girl, implying that this peculiar bear was of greater significance to her. He threw it in her direction and struck the creature with his final blow. I am appalled by the callous behavior of this individual. He then stated that he would remove her body to claim her reward, as she would not at least relinquish the list. However, at that moment, Izzo emerged, applauding his hands and declaring that he had finally located the elusive nemesis of criminals in this location. The elderly man directed his attention toward him, inquiring as to his identity. Her son then introduced himself as Izzo the Baron, the most malicious and wicked criminal in the city and the greatest alchemist of all. It appears that he was concealing his ancestral name. Cheese cleared his throat, and Izzo promptly mentioned that he nearly neglected to introduce his right-hand man, Dr. Mad Rat. Cheese promptly rectified him, asserting that they were on equal footing in this matter, and that he was not Izzo's subordinate. Aside from that, his title was Madman, Dr. Madman Rat. Izzo emphasized that his name was now too niche due to its double meaning, but Cheese countered that the repetition of a word creates a more sophisticated sound. Homework interrupted them at that moment, stating that he was not present to engage in a childish pastime and that they should return to their mothers. The protagonist scoffed, claiming that he was evidently going to be underestimated once more. Saying that this was the outcome of their most recent endeavor, they both flung sacks of money onto the ground. Upon observing the two collections, the elderly man was immediately convinced that these uncouth individuals were responsible for robbing the White Queen's bank. The two began to imitate Shellman, advising him to refrain from lavishing praise on them. Homework exhaled and drew his gun at that moment, stating that this was the first time he had encountered individuals who were so delighted to be accused of something. He then directed his attention toward them and cautioned that, in general, projectiles were too costly to be squandered on novices such as themselves. However, he would make an exception today. Izzo expressed his gratitude and expressed his eagerness to observe the sharpshooting abilities of the city's top marksman. Subsequently, he extended his best wishes to him. However, the firearm failed to discharge upon his activation. He experienced an unusual intensity of heat, and his entire arm abruptly began to tremble. He staggered forward as a wave of weakness overtook him. He then came to the realization that the money sacks contained poison. Izzo smirked, stating that it was too late for him to observe. He had already been inhaling that gas for more than a minute, and it would have rendered anyone unconscious after 8 seconds of inhalation. Homework then inquired as to what his objective was. Were they attempting to rescue this woman? Nevertheless, Izzo scoffed, asserting that he was a villain and did not believe that he would ever perform a heroic act such as preserving a life. Subsequently, he produced his diminutive firearm and declared that they harbored animosity toward the city's purported heroes. The man promptly transformed into a green slime and fled. She has chuckled, expressing her excitement that they could finally return home and enjoy some leisure time. At that moment, he observed Izzo standing with the female and inquired as to what he was doing. Izzo maintained his silence, gazing at her in awe, expressing his curiosity regarding her longevity. Her wounds were already beginning to rot, and she had lost an arm and a limb. She had also been burdened by her homework, and she was down to her last intact vertebra. He extracted a syringe and murmured that he had identified numerous contaminants in her blood. It was a miracle that she was alive, which is precisely why he was so intrigued to discover what was so unique about this woman. However, Cheese scoffed, asserting that she would not endure for an extended period of time, and that they should return immediately. Not to mention, it was impossible for him to have been contemplating the possibility of rescuing someone. Izzo responded that it was genuinely impossible. He was the most malevolent individual in the Golden City. It would be an affront to save someone. He retrieved his cloak, and Cheese acknowledged that he was apprehensive that Izzo was truly motivated to rescue the girl for a brief period. In retrospect, he observed her operating the vehicle independently and marveled at her remarkable ability to continue to function in that condition. Nevertheless, he resolved to disregard all of this. In the end, this location was home to an incalculable number of individuals who were slowly decaying. A thunderclap reverberated, and rain began to fall in the alley. The two conversed about the city's transgressions being washed away and everything being forgotten as they walked away. The unfortunate girl was left behind, gazing at her shattered teddy bear. She crawled once more, experiencing a fleeting sense of pleasure as she grasped it in her arms. Subsequently, she lost consciousness and dispersed. Or perhaps not, as Izzo returned. Did he not, everyone? The scene then transitioned to the operations room, which was reminiscent of a nightmare. Cheese inquired as to whether Izzo comprehended the activities they were conducting in that location. Izzo responded that they were conducting an operation, to which the large rodent countered that their true objective was to save a life. He inquired as to when his friend had initiated this absurdity of rescuing individuals and neglecting their objective. Izzo maintained that he had never forgotten. The objective was to re-establish the ancient Perseid family's lost honor and grandeur, and to become the most infamous villain of all. Nevertheless, the final calamity, a biological weapon, was required for this strategy to be successful. And a body that could endure this calamity required an abundance of negative emotions: sorrow, despair, wrath, and pain. However, the most challenging aspect was that this weapon required a small amount of benevolence. Because they were unable to identify an individual who satisfied the final requirement, the experiments continued to fail. Indeed, this was the reason they required this woman. She fulfilled all of the prerequisites. Cheese acknowledged his comprehension. However, she was gravely injured and could succumb at any moment. Izzo stated that this was the precise reason for initiating the final calamity immediately. He directed the rodent to prepare the cocoon of despair as they were about to commence. At that time, they employed the limbs of a blazing angel, an emerald eye from the sorrowful empress, and an infinite, unstoppable heart from a modified model. The cocoon of despair would be constructed by utilizing all of this. With that, he declared that the first miracle was to commence. He confirmed the undeniable resemblance by pressing her image against the glass in the present. Cheese inquired about the appropriate course of action. Tomorrow, Izzo declared, they would commence testing. His friend inquired as to what they would do in the event that she proved to be unsuccessful. Izzo responded that they would eliminate her. His failures were not kept at his side. A location that is adorned with a poster of a young girl who appears to be in excellent health, as well as notes, maps, and masks. That apartment belonged to Izzo. He was soundly asleep when he suddenly recalled the precise blow he had received. This caused him to toss and turn in his bed as he contemplated the reason for his inability to fall asleep. He appeared bewildered by the situation and concluded that, despite the extreme security of the location, it would be beneficial to conduct an inspection. He arrived at the core and observed that she was still present. He could now at least unwind. Nevertheless, he shortly observed that she appeared to be trembling. At that moment, he began to contemplate whether the great final calamity was apprehensive about sleeping alone at night. He abruptly retreated, asserting that it was of no consequence to him. She was merely the outcome of an experiment, which was likely defective in any case. Nevertheless, he halted once more, as he recalled her anguish and the attack that had occurred. After a long sigh, he relented and opened the chamber, instructing the final calamity to expedite his actions, as he would transport her to a more suitable location for her to rest. It was evident that she was overcome with joy, as she blushed. They traversed the Level 7 observation room meant for high-risk creatures. The wild dragon was a high-risk experiment that was conducted there. It growled, indicating that it would devour Izzo whole once it was liberated. A creature known as the Abyssal Eye also existed, and it forewarned him that it would eternally torment his mind if it escaped. Izzo smirked, stating that those two were the kindest individuals he had encountered. Consequently, he was allowing her to remain in close proximity to them. He was already walking away, saying he would go back to sleep while the monsters yelled at him, and the girl looked a bit perplexed. He returned to his bedroom and sat on the bed, murmuring that the final calamity was no longer alone. He was finally able to fall asleep without any disturbance. In the interim, the wild dragon addressed the Abyssal Eye, inquiring as to why a human girl was situated between them and the formidable creatures. The Abyssal Eye acknowledged that it was unaware, but it observed that Izzo had referred to her as the final calamity. The dragon erupted in mirth, asserting that it was impossible for a diminutive human to serve as the aforementioned final calamity. The Abyssal Eye also chuckled, remarking that it was likely just another one of Izzo's numerous failures. That is truly amusing. The dragon wept, as he observed that Izzo's crystal glass was impervious to breaking, despite the fact that the young girl's distress made her beat on the glass. It was unable to touch it, even in its B0 form. The Abyssal Eye advised her to surrender. It had already directed an innumerable laser beams at the glass, but no action had been taken. However, the female abruptly halted for a brief period. Her hand underwent a transformation, transforming into a fiery crimson entity. The glass began to crack immediately upon her contact, and both of them flinched. They stood there, observing and endeavoring to comprehend the events that transpired. Suddenly, the entire glass chamber erupted. She stood there, bewildered, gazing at her own hand, unable to comprehend the events that had transpired. The big eye was now trembling with apprehension, and the dragon's jaw was on the floor. The dragon promptly kneeled, expressing his regret and expressing that he now held his older sister in the highest regard. However, his sole desire was for her assistance in evading the situation. In the same vein, the Abyssal Eye declared that he would serve her from this point forward if she assisted him in his attempt to escape. In the midst of this, Izzo was soundly asleep, and Cheese had consumed alcohol to the point of unconsciousness. The alarm of the facility was activated at that time. The big rat inquired as to the cause of the level 4 alarm and the reason for it at a rate that was faster than the rate at which firefighters were able to dress. Izo clarified that this signal was only activated after at least 3 barriers had been obliterated. He stated that the dragon and the abyssal eye were the ones who had escaped while inside the elevator. But something else had also escaped from room 203, which was peculiar because he was certain that the room had been vacant. Izo immediately retrieved his device, declaring that he required to observe this for himself. That was the moment when he witnessed the concluding catastrophe, which resulted in the complete destruction of all the glass. He was far from concerned. Rather, he rejoiced in the fact that she had activated the limb he had transplanted. In the interim, Cheese was curious as to how the lady, who was intended to be in a different room, had ended up in that location. They arrived at the high-risk experiment location. The dragon and the abyssal eye were causing chaos in the chamber, and both of them entered. Izo inquired whether the two had already had sufficient enjoyment. I believe that the creatures abruptly tucked their tentacles between their thighs. Nevertheless, the dragon stepped forward, snarling in satisfaction that he had located the cretin who had held him captive for an extended period. It was time to pay the price for that, but Cheese drew a gun and discharged a shot at the dragon. The creature inquired as to the nature of the yellow vapor that had been dispersed in the atmosphere. Izo smirked, stating that it was a grenade containing more than 200 dragon spider larvae. He should be aware of the significance of this statement, as he is a dragon. The beast shivered, acknowledging that the spider creatures were a subspecies of dragons. They were capable of infesting and feeding on other organisms, and those who contracted their infection would succumb to death. Izo commended him, stating that at least he was intelligent. Nevertheless, the abyssal eye capitalized on the distraction by preparing an explosion that was capable of evaporating both of them in a single instant. However, Izo was aware of the abyssal eye's vulnerability. The more energy it accumulated, the more exposed its eye became. A flashbang detonated directly in front of the creature, causing it to fall to the ground and blind it. It groaned in anguish, screaming that the bastard intended to permanently blind him. Izo subsequently inquired as to whether the two individuals intended to continue causing a disturbance or if they were prepared to return to their enclosures. Nevertheless, the dragon declared that they would not surrender, particularly now that they had Big Sis's support. The abyssal eye concurred, asserting that she could dissolve the glass of this location, eliminating Izo's chances of defeating her. Izo frowned and inquired as to the identity of this Big Sis. The girl stepped forward between the two entities, and they immediately bowed. He now understood precisely who they were discussing, and if she had truly begun to lose control, the situation would become more challenging. The dragon grinned, remarking that it had been a considerable amount of time since he had observed Ezo exhibit that level of dread. Then he leaned toward the girl and murmured that Ezo was a cruel man. He had confined all of the creatures in this location and treated them as laboratory rodents. The final experiment persisted, advancing with a commanding presence that instilled dread in all who witnessed it. Cheese implored Ezo to promptly activate the emergency protocol. Nevertheless, Ezo disclosed that, regrettably, it was impossible to ensure complete protection against the ultimate catastrophe. She abruptly leapt toward them in a swift motion. She threw Izo to the ground, causing him to recoil. The enormous dragon chuckled, expressing his eagerness to witness Izo implore mercy before being infested with eggs. He would end his life if he delayed. Nevertheless, that was the moment when he observed something peculiar. She refrained from assaulting him. She was executing that cruel maneuver once more. He scowled and inquired as to what she was doing to him. Ezo attempted to dislodge her and inquire as to whether she had completed the task. She once again attempted to ascend onto him. However, he exhaled and expressed that he comprehended her purpose. She was opposed to sleeping in this location. She desired to travel to a different location. He reprimanded her for behaving in a manner that was reminiscent of that of a dog after she again pressed against him. The wild dragon summoned her, instructing her to execute the same maneuver that caused the glass to fracture once more. Izo subsequently comprehended the reason for her abrupt activation of that power. It returned to the elevator. However, she continued to operate all of the controls, resulting in a chaotic situation. In the interim, the untamed dragon was ensnared in a reflective containment suit and was urging Izo to return and remove it before the entire vicinity began to chuckle. Izo had left a collection of scallions in the abyssal eyes chamber. Then we observed a 9-headed hydra that was in its infancy. The calamity was gazing at the creature, which had opened its eye. Ezo observed that she continued to gaze at it, suggesting that she was evidently unwilling to retire to the laboratory for the night. The issue at hand was determining where she would spend the night. She stated that it was straightforward: allow her to slumber in his bedroom. However, Ezo promptly dismissed that notion as absurd. She was a subject of experimentation. The scene abruptly transitioned to a surveillance feed that had been recorded, during which a call was made to Detective 5682. The footage was glitching, but it appeared that they were in a hotel. Suddenly, the images stabilized, and they began to contemplate the cause of the large number of bodies in that location. They inquired as to what horrifying creature could have perpetrated this, as all that was left were skeletons. The detective abruptly commenced wheezing violently, prompting the individual who was recording to inquire about the situation. He examined his filthy hand and expressed concern that he had been poisoned. At that moment, an individual approached, informing them that an additional meal had been delivered. He was confronted by a black dragon and a woman who appeared to be quite perilous when he looked up. The artist surely accorded them the degree of attention they deserved. The detective was attacked by the creature on her back, and the camera was immediately interrupted. I inadvertently narrated an additional chapter. However, we are now back with our child and his rat. Izzo promptly rejected Cheese's request to retire for the night. However, the rodent persisted, asserting that the disaster girl could only experience tranquility in his presence. Izzo scoffed, asserting that it was evident after all. He had ensured that an ingredient was included that would ensure she would not cause him injury. That was the moment when Cheese disclosed that he had not included the soul extract. In reality, he had consumed it as though it were wine. Izzo was on the brink of yelling at him when his friend promptly clarified that it was his responsibility for issuing orders while inebriated. She was peacefully playing with the aquarium while he argued with the rodent, asserting that if she lost control, everyone would perish. He then realized that she had already entered the water and was tugging on the hydra. The creature appeared to be attempting to retreat, but she swiftly pursued it behind a rock. The girl was, to put it mildly, resolute. In the interim, Izzo commanded Xiaoju to exit the hydra, stating that it was not a toy. While our son continued to demand that she leave, Cheese continued to consume his cheese. He began to tug her by the leg when she refused to comply. The suffering that this girl endured was unimaginable. He plummeted to the earth. You are aware of the subsequent events. One of her many capabilities was the utilization of gravitational force to compress objects. Izzo, a gifted alchemist, lacked the physical fortitude to endure such a feat of magic. In the interim, Cheese was amused by his ordeal. Izzo, with a bruise forming on his face, issued a command to ensure that disaster would never again infiltrate Xiaoju's tank. Cheese began to depart, asserting that Izzo could continue to supervise the catastrophe girl. Izzo intended to dispute, but the large cat advised him to remain composed. The girl was exceedingly delicate and tender. Simply prevent her from entering berserker mode, as the repercussions would be beyond comprehension. The protagonist found the concept of her being a gentle lady to be absurd. In the end, she was merely a subject for experimentation. Nevertheless, she sneezed at that precise moment. He observed her with a distressed expression as he turned around. The impoverished alchemist then came to the realization that he would be obligated to force the ill girl to take a bath. He employed a scanner in the lavatory at a later time to determine whether she harbored any form of virus. Nevertheless, the device was unable to identify any objects despite conducting a 3-time scan. He was incredulous that he would be required to permit one of his experiments to use the restroom. He instructed her to bathe promptly before he departed. However, the apocalypse girl appeared bewildered, and he promptly comprehended the reason. He indicated that he was proceeding in that direction by pointing to the door. She was then directed to comply with the directive by pointing at her. He instructed her to enter and conclude the matter after signifying the action. She expressed her gratitude, stating that she comprehended. Nevertheless, she promptly complied. He reacted with astonishment. Nevertheless, he began to contemplate the reason for his embarrassment while his eyes were closed. He was an exceptional individual. However, his confidence was fleeting, as it was short-lived, as he collapsed comatose to the ground upon opening his eyes. He was later seen holding his shower head, his nose pinched shut, and frustrated with her for causing so much difficulty. He was even required to assist with this. He applied the shampoo and cautioned her against opening her eyes, as she would become blind. Additionally, that would not be his obligation. He then instructed her to turn around and sprayed water on her face to rid it of the detergent. He could not help but believe that this biological creature, composed of carbon, had successfully deceived him as he observed her expression. He disconnected the water supply, instructed her to operate the vehicle independently, and announced his departure. She was cautioned that this would be the final occasion on which she would receive assistance. He would no longer be responsible for her, as she had acquired knowledge. Nevertheless, he immediately ascended into his tragic fate, executed a full somersault and plunged directly into the water. The unfortunate individual even struck his head and moaned in agony. At that moment, he harbored remorse for not escorting her to the machine room and saturating her with a water cannon. Despite her apparent confusion, she endeavored to assist him in his recovery. She entered at that time, claiming that he had discovered the collar of revolt, which would halt the situation. However, he then observed the scene. He turned and departed without saying a word, remarking that it appeared as though the two of them had already resolved the matter. He closed the door, only to reopen it, and advised Izzo that he should wear a protective garment if he intended to do anything. In that instant, a bar of soap sailed toward him, and he vanished. Cheese muttered that it was wonderful while standing outside. Despite his exceptional abilities as an alchemist, Izzo possessed no prior experience. He observed a photograph on the wall and advised Master to rest in peace. Little would be cared for by him, and he would later assist with the experiment. He took a strand of hair, plugged it in, and began to dry her off. Nevertheless, upon observing the device's form, she abruptly recalled the numerous explosions she had endured in her previous existence. He was speaking with his eyes closed, stating that her hair was still damp. However, she was absent when he opened them. He was perplexed as to where she had fled, and he then observed her quivering behind the curtain. He drew back the curtain and instructed her to leave, as it was becoming late, as he was unaware of the reason for her behavior. Nevertheless, she was huddled in the corner, and he was unaware of the source of her panic. He came to the realization that the hairdryer may have been the cause after carefully evaluating his actions. It was logical that she would experience trauma with objects of a similar shape after recalling the manner in which Homer had taken her down in that alley. He exhaled, murmuring that she was unquestionably a nuisance. He halted and summoned the Calamity Girl as she continued to tremble. He immediately extracted the hairdryer as soon as she turned. She again flinched, hit her head, and coiled up. Then he pressed the button, and a gentle breeze began to waft. Slowly, she opened one eye and found herself gazing at him, directing the hairdryer at his face and allowing the breeze to hit him. Her expression of terror transformed into a slight chuckle. Sometime later, she was enjoying herself while drying her own hair. However, 20 minutes had elapsed, and she was still thoroughly enjoying herself. That was the moment he came to the realization that he should have allowed her to remain frightened of the object. He snatched it from her hands 30 minutes later, informing her that her hair was more than dry. She appeared to be interested in engaging in further play with it. However, he cautioned her that embodying an adorable demeanor would not be effective. He secured it in a drawer, turned the key, and instructed her to retire for the night. The unfortunate female continued to remain seated, oblivious. She was not even aware of how to speak. In the interim, Izzo was aware that the genuine issue was only just commencing. Where was he supposed to be able to induce slumber in this eccentric individual? Initially, it was impossible for her to be asleep in his bed. That was an unbreakable rule for any genuine alchemist. Nevertheless, she was already asleep peacefully on his bed when he turned around. He yanked her off, reprimanding her for violating his regulations. He was now lying on his bed, while she was sitting on the floor, pouting. A period of time had elapsed. He reminded her that she was an experiment, and experiments were not permitted on the bed. He was already being benevolent by allowing her to slumber on the floor, provided that she remained silent and did not move excessively. He then turned off the light, feeling at last that he could finally sleep soundly. Nevertheless, he paused to contemplate the situation. Despite her previous aggressive behavior, what if she transitioned into berserker mode in the midst of the night? He rolled over, but the girl was lying motionless and unresponsive. He once more placed his head on the pillow, determining that the likelihood of her launching an attack was exceedingly low. He resolved to attempt to fall asleep until he detected a noise emanating from his vicinity. He instructed her to remain seated, as he was attempting to drift off to slumber. Silence for 1 second. He smirked, but she then made another disturbance, and he instructed her to stop. He turned to her and inquired whether she intended to continue this behavior throughout the night. At that moment, he observed that she was quivering on the floor. He was perplexed by her expression of agony. In the interim, Cheese had fallen unconscious while viewing a high-quality piece of content in a separate room. Aizawa promptly referred to the image on the screen as disgusting. He struck the rodent in the face, urging him to awaken. However, Cheese simply scratched his cheek and turned over. Aizawa determined that he would have to resolve this matter independently if he was to appear to be asleep. Sometime later, he brought an insect feed and deposited it directly under Cheese's nose. The rat immediately arose and vomited. He uttered a curse and inquired as to what was the matter with his friend. However, Aizao responded by asserting that he was the one who had permitted the disaster lady to approach him. Aizao then requested that he provide him with a blanket, as he was in need of one. She smirked, stating that he was already aware it was for the girl. The lad was perpetually complaining about her, but his tender heart could not endure witnessing her anguish. Aizao, on the other hand, clarified that she is required to undergo a series of tests tomorrow and that she requires a restful night's slumber. Cheese advised him to utilize one of the 6 or 7 blankets that were available. However, Aizao clarified that he had one for each lunar cycle and day of the week. He employed blankets that symbolized the infinite cycle on the second Sunday, which was the day of Ouroboros. Tuesday and Wednesday were designated for the acquisition of knowledge and alchemy. Consequently, they served as his comforters of intelligence. On Thursday, which was the day of purification, he employed the purple color, which was the master's favorite. He slept with a spade-patterned blanket on Friday in order to hone his criminal inclinations. He was on the brink of elucidating Saturday when Cheese interrupted, asserting that he was already aware. That was the calamity blanket that was so infamous. Aizao was taken aback by his exactitude, which is why he did not have any to lend to the lady. Cheese sat down and instructed him to simply give her the disaster blanket, as she was the disaster in theory. Aizao was taken aback by the rat's impeccable logic and came to the realization that he lacked a valid argument. He attempted to object, but the rodent abruptly departed, bidding him farewell and concluding the conversation. Aizao pondered the necessity of a blanket for a rodent as he departed. He opened the safe designated Saturday while standing in front of a number of them. He placed it on the ground and informed her that it was an incredibly valuable gift that the master was lending her. She ultimately fell asleep, curling up beneath the image of a malevolent creature. He muttered that he should probably place the anti-revolt collar on her, as he had dark circles under his eyes. However, his cognitive faculties were already spent. He was incapable of responding. He simply succumbed to slumber. After a period of time, she was no longer concealed beneath the coverings. Rather, she was situated in close proximity to Aizao. Subsequently, a crow carried a clock in its mandible. It deposited it directly into the skeleton's mouth. The creature immediately began to bellow, signaling that it was time for the greatest alchemist of the century to awaken. Our boy was irritated that he had neglected to disable the device due to the crazed girl, as it continued to repeat until he eventually woke up. At that moment, he observed an unusual respiration pattern and an unusual weight. This child possessed unusual instincts, and upon recognizing their potential, he pondered the possibility. Is it possible? This was undoubtedly the case, and he was unaware that she had ascended onto his bed. However, there she was, sleeping soundly, without a trace of concern. He was contemplating at that precise moment. She lacked any resemblance to the calamity she was intended to be. Chi immediately opened the door and inquired about his night. Nevertheless, upon checking the area, he was unable to locate the girl and promptly inquired as to her whereabouts. Aizao stated that he was unaware. Chi's distress was precipitated by this, as she declared that permitting such a creature to roam freely was exceedingly perilous. Aizao concurred that it was an extreme peril. He promptly directed the large rat to inspect the monitoring room. Chai began to depart, but he soon observed an unusual occurrence. Something was trembling beneath the comforter. He brought it to Aizao's attention, but Aizao simply scoffed and inquired whether his friend had lost his sight, as if a blanket could move independently. However, disaster abruptly arose from it. Aizao endeavored to elucidate that she had entered his bed during the night. He was unaware of the events that had transpired. Nevertheless, Chi sat down next to him and nodded, indicating that he comprehended the situation. Adolescence was a challenging period for boys. He was not required to experience embarrassment. He was delighted for him. Aizao interrupted him and directed the stink grenade directly at his face. Aizao repeated himself, as his companion writhed in agony on the floor. He had previously clarified that she was the one who had entered his bed, so he was obliged to cease his idle ramblings. Chi's height was to be measured, and she was instructed to cease leaping in the experiment analysis room at a later time. At that point, they determined that the girl was 1.71 meters tall. Chi turned to Aizao and stated that he would have to stand on his tiptoes if he ever desired to kiss her, as she was 11 centimeters taller than him. It was evident that our son objected, yelling that he did not desire that at all. Her weight was the subsequent assessment. She achieved a weight of 64 kilograms. Aizao perceived that as peculiar. At least 800 kilograms should have been the entire weight of the components he had inserted into her. The rat then announced that the most critical measurement of all was about to take place. He stated with a smile that Aizao was fortunate. She possessed an ideal body measurement of 36. Subsequently, the lung capacity test was administered. Aizao exemplified the act of inhaling deeply and expelling with force into the measuring device. She became ecstatic as the small bat on the scale elevated slightly. Saying that it was her turn, he handed it to her. She was preparing herself, but she was retaining her breath in an unusual manner. He advised her to bluttle as he did. However, it appeared that she had misinterpreted the situation entirely, as she seized his face and directed all of her breath directly into his mouth. The unfortunate individual tripped over the table and fell backward. And of course, that was the moment when Cheese entered, inquiring about the respiration test. The rat simply nodded, indicating that he was beginning to adjust to the situation as our boy gasped for oxygen. In the interim, the Apocalypse Girl was perplexed as to why the diminutive bat did not exhibit any movement. Aizao was already at the sink, feverishly rinsing his mouth. Cheese casually observed that Aizao was likely the first Persian to do so in known history. He was abruptly instructed to cease speaking by our son. Chi has just chuckled, observing that he has been uttering that phrase frequently of late. However, he was curious as to whether Disaster's greeting was beneficial. At that moment, Aizao directed water directly at him. The rat simply chuckled, asserting that Aizao did not require the mask. She had been subjected to numerous experiments by him. She was not infected with any pathogens. The subsequent examination was a flexibility test, which demonstrated that she was within the typical range of human capabilities. Then, the lower body strength test was administered once more. She possessed typical levels of fortitude. Standard results were observed in a hand grasp test as well. Aizao observed that, in light of all of this, she was essentially an ordinary individual. However, Chi contended that none of this was relevant. It is probable that she had a combat mode, as this is where her genuine statistics would be displayed. Aizao concurred. It was time to activate the so-called combat mode. Kai inquired as to how, and Aizao responded. They were compelled to subject her to the most heinous and inhumane experiment they could devise. The scene transitioned to a caged girl who was in a state of extreme peril. She had even crafted a miniature figurine of Aizao expressing her longing for him. However, Chais immediately voiced their objections. This was an excessively hazardous endeavor. Throwing anyone into a fight with Test Subject 0 was an act of sheer madness. They were required to implement things incrementally. The initial adversary should be a diminutive creature, such as a rabbit. Nevertheless, Aizao seized the diminutive rodent and inquired whether it was the most fragile of their creatures. Chi seized it, asserting that rodents are never employed in experiments at this facility. The rabbit was lifted up by our son, who inquired whether Chi believed it would arouse her fighting instincts. However, she abruptly seized the rabbit and carried it to the corner. Chi declared that this was irrefutable evidence. She possessed deadly instincts. Aizao exclaimed with joy, asserting that this would be less challenging than he had anticipated. Nevertheless, it is evident that she was merely stroking the rabbit. What did this individual anticipate? He collapsed to the ground in a state of disappointment. The rabbit was then inoculated with an object that he had extracted from his pocket. Chi's immediate response was to inquire about his recent actions. Our son disclosed that it was the 6th lunacy mutation. The rabbit's eyes abruptly altered, and it began to tremble uncontrollably in her arms. The rabbit eventually transformed as a massive shadow loomed over the girl. Aizao smirked, stating that her opponent must be at least this powerful in order to awaken her powers. The creature's moniker will be Super Wild Rabbit number 1 for the time being. The creature was already in the process of winding up a punch and inhaling smoke. Additionally, our son was enthusiastic about witnessing the progression of this conflict. Nevertheless, Chi was astounded by Aizao's apparent lack of compassion. The rat inquired whether he would like to wager on whether she would avoid the strike or meet it head-on as the monster lunged. Aizao declared that the loser would be required to clean the base for a week, and he was certain that she would be the one to bear the brunt of the blow. The rabbit slammed down with full power. Neither of them hesitated. The region was devoid of any inhabitants. The girl's whereabouts were unknown to even the creature. Next, the creature experienced a peculiar sensation as it felt something slither up its arm. She was present when it gazed at its shoulder. The beast experienced a collapse. However, she was still tenderly petting it at that time. The creature itself appeared to blush slightly. At that moment, Chi's realization was that this female had no inclination to engage in combat. They proceeded directly to the zone that was exceedingly hazardous in the subsequent scenario. It appears that they intended to visit number 0. However, the rodent continued to perceive it as an unacceptable risk. Nevertheless, Aizao responded that she was a failure if she died. The failure of the experiment only served to instruct him on how to improve the likelihood of the subsequent experiment's success. Number 0 was concealed behind the substantial door. Aizao and Qi both donned their masks. However, his friend continued to maintain that it was not yet too late. They should simply abandon the situation, as they had invested an excessive amount of money in this female. Nevertheless, Aizao stated that he required to observe her advance with the intention of killing her objective. Otherwise, he would never have the opportunity to observe her genuine transformation. Recently, he had encountered an abundance of failures, and he was weary of them. But she then tenderly patted his head, causing him to be momentarily dazed. He reminded her by grabbing her hand. An experiment could not afford to feel sorry for its creator. She approached him, announcing that she would employ all of her capabilities. She would perish at the hands of number 0 if she did not. Her very existence was intended to serve as the most potent biological weapon and assist him in his global conquest. Chai, on the other hand, contended that he should value her physical appearance. Put all of that into combat was such a waste. In the meantime, number 0 was tallying the diminutive Azeos behind the massive gate. She was creating miniature puppets of him. Lucille, a creature of the Black Plague, was an entity that posed an exceptionally high risk. At that moment, her name was summoned by an individual. She reversed direction. Izao announced that he had arrived to engage in conversation. She transformed into a black vapor, grasping the bars of the cage with fervor, and her voice erupted with enthusiasm. It had been precisely 1,322 days since their most recent encounter. However, Aizao simply stated that he was present to provide her with information. He had ultimately wrought the ultimate catastrophe. She was no longer the most powerful creature in his possession. Lucille was taken aback. She immediately refuted the claim, asserting that it was impossible. She was the most potent entity in the entire laboratory. Aizao instructed Cheese to introduce the culminating disaster. However, she had already advanced and embraced Aizao. Lucille was perplexed as she held the container. This was not a case of confusion. Jealousy was the cause. She snarled, urging the unclean blonde to remove her hands from Aizao. A small catastrophe concealed itself behind him. Our boy introduced her to Lucille, the final disaster and the most powerful creation he had ever created. Lucille would have to defeat the blonde in order to reclaim her status as the strongest experiment. Lucille bit her lip in anger and then smirked. All right. However, Aizao would be obligated to spend the entire day with her if she were to prevail. He promptly consented to the agreement. Subsequently, she stipulated that he would be required to permit her to embrace him while he was asleep if he remained for an entire day. However, our son immediately declared that this was an excessive amount. This Lucille was unquestionably robust, deserving of the designation of experiment number 0. She assured him that there was no need for concern. She would demolish his latest creation. Aizao exited the room, asserting that she was compelled to demonstrate her assertion. He exited through the door, foreshadowing the ultimate catastrophe. She would truly perish if she did not engage in combat this time. Furthermore, he would not experience the faintest iota of remorse if she were to succumb to Lucille, as this would merely indicate that she was a failure. Additionally, he would refrain from intervening or attempting to rescue her. She appeared perplexed until he untied the cord that bound them. She flinched in astonishment as the door slammed shut in front of her. This girl continued to endure hardship. There was an increasing sense of cruelty. She struck the door. However, Aizao stood on the opposite side, evidently unperturbed. He admitted that he was correct. This was the appropriate approach for a genuine Perseid descendant to approach their experiments. Ultimately, all was restored to its proper course. After that, he proceeded to the monitoring room. She has inquired about the conversation. However, Aizao has only recently directed him to release Lucille. Despite the rat's irritation, it continued to press the trigger. Lucille stretched her limbs as the cage began to ascend, lamenting that it had been an inordinate amount of time since she had been able to move adequately. She promptly examined one of the cameras in the room and instructed both individuals to prepare themselves. They were about to witness an extraordinary event. She promptly handed Aizao a bag of chips, stating that this was going to be an excellent one. However, Aizao expressed his dissatisfaction. He was growing weary of the fact that everything had a cheese flavor. The rodent was incensed, asserting that he had never previously expressed dissatisfaction with this matter. He then reassured him that the collar would activate, thereby isolating the powers of catastrophe in the event that Lucille actually goes for the kill. It was time for another wager. Who would emerge victorious in this conflict? Lucille was the subject of the rat's wager. Upon his victory, he desired to retain control of the television remote for a week. Izao wagered on the final catastrophe, as she was convinced that she would perish if she did not prevail. Lucille instructed her to cease pounding on the door while she was within the chamber. It was impossible to unlock. Afterward, she began to contemplate the girl's circumstances. Despite her lack of desire to engage in combat, she activated her abilities, asserting that it was irrelevant. After she had completed her, she would have Izao exclusively. She stated that the situation was becoming increasingly perilous at that time. Lucille was making progress, and the catastrophe girl had not responded in any way. Lucille extended her hand, anticipating her absorption as her subsequent nutrient. However, abruptly, something grasped her arm. It was the little blonde Calamity. Lucille was unaware of her rapid pace. The two lads were immediately filled with enthusiasm. Ultimately, she transitioned into combat mode. They expressed their excitement at the prospect of things finally becoming serious by exchanging high fives. However, the diminutive blonde proceeded on foot. Lucille was perplexed. What was her objective? She then pointed to the door, and that was the moment when they both came to the realization. She requested Lucille's assistance in opening it. It is evident that experiment number 0 was incensed by the absurd request. However, the diminutive blonde merely beamed and nodded. That was precisely her objective. The monster began to guffaw and became completely insane at that moment. She turned to the camera and addressed little Izao, stating that this final creation of his was nothing more than an imbecile. She seized the girl's arm and announced that she would demonstrate the most straightforward route out of the room. Lucille's poison commenced to disseminate. She wept at the prospect of the Black Plague virus rapidly transforming her into a heap of bones. Lucille laughed as the blonde collapsed to the ground, claiming that it was exceedingly simple to vanquish this purported disaster experiment. She then seized her by the face and advised her to always remember. She was the owner of little Izao. Red alerts were displayed on the body panel of the final catastrophe. She has expressed her sorrow over the rapid dissemination of the virus, which has compromised her entire bloodstream and her organs. Izao stated that this was impossible, as the blood they administered to her was entirely immune to any form of infection. However, she was evidently and significantly infected in that location. Lucille sat there, giggling, and declared that this was not even enjoyable. She shrieked at him to cease immediately, but Izao advised him to remain composed. He clarified that the infection was contained to only 30% of her blood, 42% of her organs, and 38% of her nerves, which means that there was no risk of death. He was certain that her powers would activate the instant she reached the brink of death. Nevertheless, Lucille was stomping on the girl's cranium. She inquired of Izao whether this was the extent of his offerings. Lucille taunted the blonde, who was unable to respond. Where was the surge of energy she experienced when she requested assistance in opening the door? She yelled at him once more to cease, as the virus had already infected 70% of her body. However, Izao responded that she possessed a mechanical heart that was impervious to infection. Also, the pathogen had not yet infiltrated her brain. Lucille sneered, stating that it appeared as though Izo had no regard for the girl, and if that was the case, it was time to conclude this. There was an apparent increase in the virus's intensity, which spread throughout her entire body. Lucille smirked as the blonde began to levitate, announcing that she would now commence absorption. She observed that she actually tasted quite delicious, despite the fact that the experiment was clearly flawed, as she bit into her cheek. The plague beast then sank her fangs into the girl's stomach, declaring that the genuine feast would commence. She has urgently proclaimed that he was activating the collar. The bulk of that experiment had already been compromised to the extent of 90%. However, just as he was about to press the button, Izao grabbed his wrist. The youngster was adamant about his actions, despite the rat's inquiries. The time had not yet arrived. She was under the impression that his friend had lost his sanity. Did he truly intend to observe Lucille consume the experiment? However, Izao abruptly instructed him to cease speaking. You are merely a foolish rodent. You are only interested in her because she is attractive. At no time have you been as invested in the other experiments as you are now. The genuine objective of the Perseid family must not be overlooked. Both the girl and Lucille were merely instruments for the genuine ambition. But then, A voice that was shaking cried out, "M, a master." He observed that the girl had submitted the request, as the screen was illuminated by notifications. She was astounded to discover that the Calamity had spoken, and wondered if Izo had imparted any knowledge to her. He responded that it was possible that it was just a little bit the night before. He had previously reprimanded her for attempting to ascend onto his bed, informing her that experiments were not conducted while he was sleeping. However, upon his initial observation, she appeared to be in a state of distress and melancholy. Therefore, he cleared his larynx and declared that he would grant her permission to remain in the position for an additional 30 minutes if she addressed him as master. Despite the fact that her vocal cords had been removed in the past, the new body he created was evidently uninjured. Nevertheless, she was unable to expel any substance, despite her efforts. That was the moment when he came to terms with the reality. She possessed vocal cords, however, she had forgotten how to communicate. He sat down and instructed her to repeat his words. His lips moved in an exaggerated manner, gradually forming the words master and person. She observed with great attention, but she was unable to express any sentiment. The youngster was unkind. He pondered how an individual could be so sluggish. She made another attempt, but the only sound that emerged was a small whimper. He concealed his expression, acknowledging that it was evidently impossible to avoid. He abruptly retreated, advising her to retire for the night. But upon returning to her blanket, she continued to attempt to replicate the movements he had demonstrated until she was on the brink of falling unconscious. She murmured, "Master." For the first time, she was once again calling out for her master during the conflict. Lucille, however, dismissed her appeals as meaningless. She was nothing but a failure to him, and it was now time for her to be consumed. However, Lucille's collar immediately activated, causing her to collapse to the ground. A thermal discharge permeated her body, rendering her immobile. She summoned Aizawa. It was evident that he was the individual who had pressed the trigger. Nonchalantly, Aizawa acknowledged that Cheese was correct. Losing the implants that were inserted into her would be an unacceptable risk. Cheese inquired immediately whether he had pressed it solely because his creation had addressed him as master. He sneered, "Certainly not. I would never engage in such an action." He was now on his way to retrieve this futile instrument. Cheese intended to pursue, but Aizawa prevented him. Not required. The final catastrophe remained motionless on the ground. Suddenly, an individual in a cloaked cloak emerged. She rotated her head and yelled, "Master!" However, Aizawa promptly silenced her. "Please refrain from uttering that." He glared. "You are not entitled to address me in that manner." He was freezing, yet simultaneously. He lifted her into his arms and led her out of the area. She continued to reiterate her request to master, but he continued to advise her to remain silent and prepare for confinement. Lucille inquired as he passed her. He never intervened in any of the other experiments in which he had sent her to fight, even when they were on the verge of death. Therefore, why did he rescue this lady who was inferior to her in every aspect, including intelligence, combat power, and physical strength? Aizawa responded that the reason was that she had a number of transplanted organs, and the experiment would be impeded if she were to be consumed. Lucille responded that there was no issue in that scenario. In the interim, Cheese was perusing a high-quality source, and he concluded that Aizawa should discontinue his small-scale antics. Additionally, he observed that the White Queen possessed several noteworthy attributes. However, an unusual event occurred abruptly. Lucille's temperature began to decrease as it stabilized. Cheese was taken aback when the alarm began to sound. Cheese's message, which instructed him to evacuate the premises immediately, arrived as Aizawa was preparing to depart. Cheese forewarned Armoy that Lucille's collar had fractured, and Armoy inquired as to the cause of his anxiety. He had frozen, and it was already too late when he turned around. She was in close proximity to him. Lucille exhaled, expressing her disappointment. But this time, the collar was not going to be effective. It is imperative that you, as an adept alchemist, are aware that pathogens occasionally adjust to their surroundings. She had repeatedly activated its effect for more than 1,000 days, and in the past week, the plague viruses in her body began to adapt to the cold and develop a resistance to it. Aizawa attempted to control his emotions, but he was unable to further incite her. Therefore, he informed Lucille that she had prevailed and that he would discharge his obligation. However, she chuckled and complained that a single day with her was inadequate. He removed his disguise, and she gazed at him with interest. She touched his visage, and the virus began to disseminate throughout his body. Despite the fact that the boy was on the brink of death, His face was turning red for an unknown cause. Lucille was overjoyed, asserting that she could now comprehend each cell's operation. Cheese was in a state of distress as he observed the screen, but Lucille advised him to remain composed. She had implanted the virus within him, however it remained latent due to her reluctance to endanger her infant son, Izao. She abruptly observed something peculiar as the virus progressed toward his mouth. Some of the saliva cells from the final catastrophe were infected by the Black Plague virus. Obviously, she was incensed at that precise moment. It was crystal clear to her what transpired. She seized the blonde's face, demanding to know how she had the audacity to kiss her Izao. Cheese was aware that there was no benefit in attempting to deceive. Ultimately, she possessed the capacity to recognize at the cellular level. The final disaster's entire body was once again infected by her pathogen. She exclaimed that this was unforgivable as she raised her high into the air. She would infiltrate every cell in her body and guarantee that she would endure the most severe conceivable fate. Izao was unable to devise a plan to escape this predicament, as the final catastrophe suffered in agony. Lucille was impervious to any form of weaponry, due to her complete control over her body and cells. He was at a loss as to what to do in the absence of the frigid collar, which had been the sole solution. The void substance was still in the testing phase, and its use could potentially obliterate the entire base. Nevertheless, he still possessed it. He pondered whether there was truly no solution, as he observed her pulverize his experiment. Cheese declared that he was aware of the appropriate course of action at that precise instant, prompting Izao to inquire as to how. The rat clarified that Lucille was deeply enamored with him, and that was the sole method of preventing her. Lucille was muttering that she could not comprehend why she was unable to penetrate the brain or the heart, but she would consume everything else. At that moment, Izao addressed her. He declared that this was his final warning by directing the slime transformer at himself. The monster scoffed, inquiring as to whether she was truly under peril due to that idiot. He responded by admitting that the girl was significant, but the components he had implanted into her were more significant. He would be unable to conquer the world or restore the Perseid family's grandeur without them, which would rob him of his entire reason for living. Cheese murmured to himself, admiring his acting abilities, and Lucille, to her surprise, appeared to concur. Izao was alarmed by her sudden capitulation. It is possible that this was a method of controlling her, despite the fact that it was degrading. However, she continued to consume the final catastrophe, asserting that she would assist him in conquering the world regardless of the extent of her consumption. Izao came to the realization that he was compelled to employ his trump card as the virus continued to propagate. Cheese grinned, remarking that it appeared as though he had been delaying, as he had maintained a contingency strategy throughout. However, the reality was that this trump card was humiliating, and Izao was genuinely hesitant to employ it. He sighed and informed Lucille that he would sleep with the girl in his bosom for the next few nights if she allowed her to live. She was immediately paralyzed, her pupils wide. She approached him, inquiring as to whether that assertion was accurate. She was already envisioning the delightful experience in her mind. Izao could discern from her reaction that she was visualizing an excessive amount. So, he inquired as to whether she concurred. She hummed in contemplation before expressing that she might be able to forgive that piece of garbage. However, she was subject to two constraints. She beamed in response to his inquiry regarding their nature. The first was that she would be released from her cage, and the girl would assume her place, remaining imprisoned indefinitely. Izao was aware that he would devise an alternative method to suppress her at a later time. However, he consented to do so for the time being. She then proceeded to the subsequent circumstance. She initiated the virus extraction process and instructed the refuse girl to awaken. She advised her to exercise caution as she was about to execute an action. She seized Izao's face, expressing her rage at the female who had stolen his first kiss. He was already aware of the impending calamity and attempted to elucidate that the final catastrophe was unaware of these concepts. However, it was too late. Lucille had already initiated her assault. The final catastrophe, of course, observed the event and began to question the severity of her chest pain. Our son was unable to escape, and Lucille's assault was unwavering. Cheese muttered that he was content as a friend, while he continued to shove away the cursed woman who would not relinquish her grip. Or it is possible that he was experiencing melancholy. He was uncertain about his emotions. Lucille stood there, utterly content, as the torture ultimately concluded. Shigen stated that he was continuing to use the same lavender-flavored toothpaste as before. In the interim, Izao was feverishly spraying his mouth, but Lucille simply smiled, stating that it was futile. His body had already been infiltrated by her cells. The final disaster continued to experience that peculiar agony as he fell to the ground. She was unable to comprehend the situation. In the interim, the pathogen was permeating her bloodstream. The virus was detected and attacked by her red blood cells in an abrupt and unexpected manner. In an instant, Lucille turned back to observe that the girl had been purified. She began to assert that it was impossible. But before she could complete her sentence, she was lifted off the ground and seized by the neck. The girl's limb underwent a transformation, and both alchemists immediately identified it. The Ashen Angel's limb. The final calamity began to speak, expressing her dissatisfaction with something. She was still unable to speak clearly, so it was unclear what she was referring to. However, Lucille was on fire. Next, the scene transitioned to a desolate desolation where a man stood. He murmured that the creature had already consumed all of the fluids and poisons he had administered to her. So why was she not losing consciousness? She devised an assault and directed it at him. He lowered his head, stating that it was irrelevant. Gotcha had successfully evaded the island, and that was sufficient. However, a woman with purple hair who towered over him suddenly appeared, caressing him and urging him to cease sacrificing himself without authorization. A barrier appeared, obstructing the attack, and he addressed her by name. She grasped his face and informed him shortly after the blow was neutralized. He was prohibited from abandoning her in that manner from this point forward. He was on the brink of kissing her as he approached her. However, he was instead stomped on the face, and the woman bitterly declared that the kiss scene would not be aired because she did not wish to witness his repulsive tongue. It appears that the entirety of this was a film recording, and I am equally perplexed as you are. I am simply adhering to the narrative, and it appears that this is a component of the narrative. Consequently, we are not at a loss. It was discovered that the phoenix depicted in this scene was genuine. They were even providing her with shells to consume. And all of this was taking place in Gordon City, on the set of a film that featured the White Queen, which, if I recall correctly, was the same narrative that our rat boy had been reading earlier. The White Queen was not merely the second-ranked hero of the Golden City. Additionally, she was the most renowned actress in the globe. The woman apologized for the situation, stating that the actor in the film was rendered immobile. She also mentioned that he was the sole individual they could locate. However, the White Queen scoffed, asserting that this individual was insignificant in comparison to the one she truly admired. His facial expressions were unremarkable, lacking in emotion, and inadequately executed. The assistant hesitantly acknowledged that they were aware that he did not meet her expectations. However, they were facing a financial crisis after auditioning more than 2,000 individuals. However, the Queen simply sighed, stating that it was irrelevant. They could simply withdraw $200 million from her bank account. At that time, an individual approached her with imperative news, prompting her to inquire about its significance. What information was there regarding the robbery of her bank? Although we are all aware of the perpetrators, one individual claimed that the criminals had employed a chemical device. A typical human and an individual who resembled a rodent were present. She presented the device, and the White Queen immediately recognized the symbol. The masked woman further stated that an unknown weapon had rendered even Homerican, an officer of exceptional competence, into a sludge. She was about to propose that they gather reinforcements. However, the White Queen interrupted her, directing that no one should attempt to interfere. The masked woman objected, asserting that it was impossible to manage independently. The martyrs were executed in that region. However, the Queen underwent a transformation. Her irises shone with an ethereal radiance, and her hair turned white. She asserted that the execution zone of the heroes was irrelevant to her and the perpetrators, and she stepped forward. They appeared to possess the solutions she had been seeking for an extended period of time. She directed her team to expedite the process of locating the perpetrators by abandoning all other plans. The actress on the set hesitated and inquired about the course of action for the film. The White Queen merely instructed that all activities be suspended for the time being. She turned to depart, but abruptly halted. She had nearly forgotten about him. She approached the unfortunate actor and inquired whether he truly desired to kiss her. He struggled to articulate his apologies. However, she conjured a colossal ice block and forced it into his mouth. She observed him endure suffering for a brief period before remarking that he was fortunate. She would forgive him this time, and as she walked away, she coldly stated, "No one in this world is allowed to touch my lips." The scene shifted, a fallen bucket on the ground, a glimpse into someone's past. A woman sternly told a young girl that she wasn't allowed to play until she finished cleaning the floor. The child clutched a teddy bear, one that looked remarkably similar to the one the final disaster also had. The woman yanked the bear from her hands and stomped on it. The girl pleaded, begging, "Won't you, man, please stop?" But the man beside her was the one who got slapped. The figure who appeared to be the White Queen's father grabbed her, telling Jimin not to treat her like that. But Jimin simply reminded him. It was her who took them off the streets. It was her who made sure they didn't starve to death. The father, called Mailer, had no response to that. A man suddenly appeared behind Jimin and asked if this was the family providing children to serve as soldiers. She smiled and said yes, that the offering was this girl. The father, however, was terrified, demanding to know who this man was and why he had entered without knocking. The mysterious man replied that the Ming Quan did not need permission to enter any place in this kingdom. The father flinched upon hearing that name and turned to Jimin, asking what she was thinking. She responded that it was obvious. She was securing a good home for this child. The girl would be taken by this organization and trained from a young age to become a soldier. The man stepped closer, asking if this was the girl, and Jimin told him not to be deceived. She was young, but she was strong. She could even endure 3 days without eating. The man observed her carefully, seeming to like the determination in her eyes. He declared that she would be taken, and in the next second, he was already leaving with her. Now, I get it. This was actually the backstory of the final disaster, huh? And now we're back to the present. She was in the room looking at a piece of that story. Meanwhile, the alchemists were analyzing the rabbit, which was mysteriously losing a ton of fur from its chest, and they had no idea why. She's asked if the disaster was okay, and Izao replied that, at the very least, her vital signs were stable. A quick flashback to a few years ago. A girl was using healing magic, channeling power into the leader of the underworld hounds known as the Hunting Master. The man from the earlier story, called Doberman, introduced himself to the master, who asked about the assassination. Doberman listed several names of allies, stating that all of them had died. The Hunting Master was in disbelief. How was it possible for so many to have failed in killing the traitors of the Latoma dynasty? Doberman clarified everyone had died except for Yorkshire. She had disappeared. It seemed like everyone had dog names. The master was visibly shaken and thin. We were back in the present, with Izao pacing around the room. He suddenly shouted that he had an idea, and Cheese groaned, telling him to stop yelling so much. Izao declared that he was tired of calling her final disaster, so she needed a code name. And her code name would be Alpina. He asked if Cheese wasn't curious about why he chose that name, but the rat just told him to get to the point. He recalled that his master once said that Alpina was her favorite flower. It symbolized young women. However, he told the rat that he wasn't going to explain the meaning behind the name. With that, the two of them celebrated. She had officially become an extremely dangerous experiment. Izao commented that her biggest advantage was her gentle personality, but the biggest problem was how unstable her powers were. The first mission was to understand how she activated her arm. The first time was when she was afraid of sleeping alone in the cage. Cheese immediately claimed that the solution was obvious. She activated her power whenever she wanted to sleep next to Izao. Izao ignored that and said the second time was when he crouched, and she must have interpreted it as him being attacked by Lucille. That was when she activated the thermal pressure vaporization cannon. Cheese immediately interrupted, asking since when it had such a ridiculous name. Izao proudly stated that it had that name since the moment she obliterated Lucille, and he thought it sounded awesome. Cheese strongly disagreed. Izao then pointed out the most interesting thing about the attack. It had nearly reached the temperature of the sun, even managing to completely vaporize the Black Plague virus. Cheese commented that if Lucille hadn't been equipped with the ice collar, she definitely would have died. At that moment, Lucille was still submerged, suffering in recovery. Suddenly, Alpina's stomach rumbled. Izao turned to look, and she clearly looked like she was starving. Then she pointed to herself and said, "Hungry, master." Apparently, she had learned to talk out of nowhere. Cheese asked why they had never seen Izao feed her before. Izao replied that he simply assumed a creature destined to bring the final disaster wouldn't need something as primitive as food. However, she didn't need to worry. They had plenty of highly nutritious and energy-rich meals. Sometime later, Cheese stared in disbelief, asking if he seriously prepared that for her. But Izao confidently said yes. It was perfect. The poor wild dragon who had been peacefully sleeping was about to become food. The dragon woke up froggy, asking what the two of them were doing there. Then his expression suddenly turned friendly, saying he was desperate to get out of the restrictive gear he was wearing. Aizawa smiled, telling him that he would indeed have a chance to redeem himself. The dragon was excited, until Aizawa finished his sentence, saying he was about to become the girl's next meal. Aizawa's expression immediately changed. Cheese protested, saying that the Storm Malice dragon was the only true dragon they had, and it would be a waste to throw him away like this. But Aizawa disagreed. He believed that if Alpina consumed him, she would unlock a new form. He ordered her to devour him. She repeated his words, and suddenly she was on the dragon's horns. The poor thing was crying in desperation, begging for his life, swearing that he would never talk bad about the boss again. But Aizawa coldly replied, "Too late." Alpina got ready and chomped down on his horn. But obviously, that only ended up hurting her mouth like an idiot. Sometime later, there was boiling instant noodles instead, so that's what she was going to eat. 3 minutes it was all ready, and Alpina's eyes were shining. Our boy handed over the chopsticks and immediately asked what the crazy girl was doing. Obviously, she was eating with her hands without a care in the world. He warned her to be careful since the food was hot. Meanwhile, Chess was wondering if she really didn't know how to use chopsticks, or if she was just that starving. However, she kept eating until she suddenly stopped for a second and cried, and said it was delicious. Aizawa, as cruel as always, just told her to stop crying over instant noodles because it was embarrassing. Chess, on the other hand, understood that she probably hadn't eaten many good things in her life. The protagonist then said that it was just like his friend, who, being a rat, used to sneak into this place to steal cheese until the day he got caught and almost got shot. But Chess told him to shut up, saying that he had heard that the protagonist begged for milk until he was 3 years old. Aizawa threw his chopstick at his friend, saying it was his mother's fault for telling him there was something inside the magic box. The two started fighting, things flying everywhere, while Alpina ate peacefully. Our boy called the rat a filthy thief, but Chess replied that stealing cheese wasn't an insult for a rat. It was actually a compliment. With that, she finally finished eating, handed the bowl back to our boy, and said it was delicious. He then wiped her mouth, saying it was ridiculous how messy she got just from eating something like that. However, her stomach was still growling. A little while later, there were piles and piles of instant noodles, and she was still devouring them. But at least now she had learned how to use chopsticks. Once again, she wiped her mouth and handed the bowl to Aizawa. He told Chess to prepare another one, but Chess informed him that, unfortunately, that was the last one. An hour later, Aizawa was desperate, telling her to stay away. It was his last box of chocolate, and he begged her to show some mercy. Meanwhile, he wondered why she was acting like this now with chocolate when she had been normal with instant noodles. The girl was crawling like a monster, looking at him with a pleading expression, saying she wanted more of that thing. Seeing himself cornered, Aizawa had no choice. He immediately opened the wafers and started eating. His mouth was full, but man, she came for the theft. The poor guy had no options left, and now you might think this girl is going too far. Let the guy eat his wafers in peace. A while later, he was lying on the ground, completely done. But the hunger wasn't over. At that moment, Chess got scared. He was already standing in front of his cheese shelf, prepared to defend it with his life. This was the secret stash he had worked hard for years to build. However, Alpina crouched down and started sniffing. She immediately realized she was on ground, placed her hand down, and activated her angel arm. The moment the big rat looked up, the ceiling was melting. He jumped back, screaming that they were doomed, and at that moment she dived in. As soon as she stood up, he pointed his weapon at her and warned that stealing Aizawa's sweets was one thing, but this cheese was sacred. But in just 1 second, she was already in his face with the angel arm, touched the weapon, and snatched it from him. The poor guy had no way to hold on to it, as the heat almost burned his little hands. The moment he looked ahead, the entire weapon had already melted into nothing. The poor guy collapsed to the ground, knowing the end was near. She grabbed the first box and started eating his cheese. A few seconds later, all of them were empty on the floor. Meanwhile, the big rat lay on the ground, saying this was truly a final disaster. Meanwhile, in the monster prison, the Abyssal Eye asked the dragon if he was okay, since he had heard that he was supposed to be fed to disaster. However, the dragon said they gave up on that plan, since he was a very strong dragon with an extremely resistant body. He was about to show that his horn was the strongest part, but at that exact moment, the thing completely shattered. He screamed in despair, saying that his most majestic part was gone. A little while later, the final disaster was back, locked up where she had been created. It was said that after countless tests, it had been proven that she had zero resistance when it came to sweets, especially chocolate. As soon as she tasted it, she would enter a hunger frenzy where nothing would survive, even going so far as to use her angel arm. At that moment, he turned around and asked why his friend wasn't saying anything. The big rat was foaming at the mouth, saying that she had eaten 400 blocks of the most expensive cheese in existence. His vintage collection was over 140 years old, and that was why this perverse experiment needed to be punished in the most severe way possible. He prepared a saw, saying that first, he would start by cutting her into at least 1,200 pieces. Easel, however, simply commented that she was still cute. Then, the rat said he would wash her eyes with the two cruelest fluids they possessed. Again, Ezo said she was still cute. But the rat insisted that she deserved to be bitten by a brain-sucking mosquito. Yet again, Ezel said she was cute. Finally, the rat said that at the very least, she needed a few smacks to learn her lesson. Even though Ezel had been saying she was cute, he was actually thinking that she really did need to be punished. Otherwise, they would never get to eat any more delicious food in this place. Later, he asked if she was ready for a punishment. And for a cruel alchemist, I expected something a lot more chemical, to be honest. He thought that since she had such a childish mind, the best form of punishment was still to with that. He delivered the first attack, and the poor girl cried out in pain. While she was being struck without mercy, he told her that this was for being greedy and eating all the chocolates and all that cheese. Sometime later, the girl really got sucked in and was now crying desperately. Ezel told Chess that this would teach her not to repeat the same mistake. The rat agreed, but said the real problem now was that they had nothing left to eat in this base except for experimental food. The protagonist's stomach growled, and he agreed, saying that they hadn't even had dinner yet. With that, she got beaten up again. Then the rat mentioned another big problem. When they went out to buy or do something, were they just going to leave her alone in the base? Ezel said that was impossible because she would destroy everything while they were gone. Looking down at the poor girl, he said he had no choice but to take her along. Sometime later, he was putting on his vest, and the rat was fastening his belt. He adjusted the buckle, threw on his cape, packed his poisons, and it was time to go hunt for food. Meanwhile, Alpenia just stood there, staring at the two of them. They taught her to raise her arm and strike some poses to look cool the next time something like this happened. Then Ezel ordered the activation of the Matrix teleportation, targeting the Beacon District. The teleportation circle was gigantic, and the three of them were right in the middle of it. She grabbed Ezel's hand, making him wonder how weird it was or how much her personality fluctuated. With that, Jess started counting to 3 and then covered her eyes. The teleportation activated, and an alchemy circle appeared in another part of the city. With that, our boy emerged, spreading his arms and welcoming them to the paradise of crime, the Golden City. They were standing on top of the city's lighthouse when the 32 teleportation points. Ezel said that out of all the places, this one was still his favorite since you could see everything from above. Disaster took a look and was impressed. Meanwhile, the big rat asked if they were heading straight for the megastore, but the boy replied that for now, they would stop by a clothing store because the girl looked peculiar. They would go down Kamula Avenue, where there was definitely something perfect for her. The rat, however, pointed out that that place only had expensive clothes, and on top of that, their bank money was already running low. To which Ezel responded that that was exactly why they would also use this opportunity to scout for their next heist. He told the girl to hold his hand, and as soon as she did, he jumped off the lighthouse with her. Mid-fall, he activated anti-gravity alchemy. The symbol on his neck glowed, and she slowly opened her eyes, until she realized they were floating. Our boy led the way, while the big rat said that as soon as they landed, he wanted at least one hot dog. The scene then shifted to a part of the city known as Amberlit. In the middle of the fountain stood a golden statue of a woman. Alchemy Girl was fascinated, while Ezel wondered why the rat was taking so long just to buy a hot dog. Then he noticed a little boy standing in front of him, saying that his little sister was climbing really high. Our boy laughed, thinking that was impossible. There were way too many people patrolling that area. That's when he realized the boy had said little sister. He looked to the side, and sure enough, there she was climbing the statue. From below, he shouted for her to get down immediately, but she just sat on the statue's head and waved at her master. Meanwhile, the rat was arguing with the hot dog vendor, saying that he had told the guy 1,000 times not to put anything sour on his hot dog. He took a bite and celebrated, saying it took a while, but it finally had the perfect taste. Then he remembered Ezel. At that moment, he saw 2 policemen walking by and pointing up. Noticing the crowd gathering around the statue, he wondered how it was possible for him to disappear for just 10 seconds and for all this to happen. The officer grabbed a megaphone, saying that the Camelot statue was extremely important, so she needed to come down immediately. But the girl just shook her head, signaling no. The rat knew that climbing that statue without authorization was a serious crime in the City of Heroes. He put on his sunglasses, knowing he had to act fast. First, he was going to flee and leave his partners behind, because that's how a villain survives. Meanwhile, Ezel threw a flashbang in the air, which exploded in front of the statue and everyone around it. As he did, he muttered to himself that he would never take that woman out of the lab again. The police officers were then all taken down by the big rat, using his tail to wield a knife. He ordered Ezel to grab the girl because, at that moment, he was going to act like a hero. But our boy replied that he saw very well that the rat had just tried to escape alone. One of the officers started to regain consciousness, but as soon as he tried to stand up, he tripped over his own uniform and face-planted onto the ground. Apparently, the trio had escaped with ease and were already in another part of the city. However, our boy was exhausted, saying that one day this idiot was going to get them all killed. That's when someone nearby told them to get their filthy hands off and move away from the store. The employee beside him said that the golden legacy was extremely important and couldn't be tainted by people like them. But Ezel just asked Chess what they were going to do about this guy complaining that they were dirty. The rat immediately started licking himself, having fun with it. That's when the shopkeeper threatened to find someone to take care of the two of them, until Chess just stuck a banknote to his saliva and the guy was horrified. He kept making a sequence of money, and Ezel asked what they were going to do now that the money they were supposed to pay for the mess was all stuck together. The moment the guy changed his attitude, he said that a little saliva was nothing, considering what great customers they were. He happily went to peel the money off with ease, while from inside Ezel waved him goodbye. A little while later, he asked the young master what kind of clothing he was looking for. Our boy said it wasn't for him, but for the girl. The seller approached Disaster and asked what such a distinguished young lady was looking for. She looked back with her finger up the mannequin's nose and giggled. The guy was stunned by how beautiful she was, thinking he had never seen such perfection. He hadn't really noticed it when she was outside, but now he could tell she was truly different. Watching Ezel ordering her around, he started thinking that this poor goddess was being enslaved by that weirdo. That's when Ezel told him to hurry up and bring the best dresses they had. She would try them on one by one. With that, the women brought a whole bunch of them and immediately took the girl away as she called out for her master. He just told her not to make a mess. It was a simple outfit change. He sat down and the guy served him tea, but our boy said he wasn't in the mood for that. He called out to the filthy rat and told him to hand over the soda he had seen in hiding. Chess handed it over but told him to quit nagging. He was busy looking for a cool hat. 20 minutes passed and Ezel wondered why it was taking so long. One of the women called for help, saying that it wasn't easy to dress this girl. When he pulled back the curtain, she was there, trembling. He then told her to stop making a fuss because he was right outside. With that, the women continued helping her while she kept calling out for her, to which he responded from outside that he was right there. She called for him again, and once more, he said he was right there. She called for him again, and yet again, he assured her he was there. Then she stepped out wearing a crimson evening gown that cost $159,000. Ezel thought to himself that she actually looked good in it. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper asked what he thought. The piece was extremely exclusive. The guy said that his girlfriend deserved something like that, but Ezel quickly corrected him, saying she wasn't his girlfriend, she was his servant. If he called her that again, he would have his tongue cut off. The seller was shocked that guy was buying something so expensive for his servant. He must be filthy rich. But then Ezel said that this dress barely met his standards, so they'd better bring something better. The seller assured him not to worry. All the wealthiest people in the city shopped here. She then appeared wearing the sacred bloom dress, priced at $300,000. Ezel admitted that it was pretty, but it lacked dignity. He told him to bring another. Then she tried on the Golden Empress gown minus $340,000. Man, the price just kept going up. Ezel was speechless for a second while the seller kept calling out to the young master. The man explained that this dress was originally made for the Empress herself, so surely it must be to his liking. But at that exact moment, a Batman-style limousine pulled up in front of the store. The staff rolled out a carpet, and suddenly, the shopkeeper looked nervous, saying he had forgotten about today's visitor. He told the three of them to hide and stay quiet, or they would all be in serious danger. Then a door opened, revealing a girl frame by frame. She was dressed in traditional Japanese clothing and flanked by two demons. From the Haigong family, this was Rin, though she seemed poor, considering she didn't even have sandals. As soon as she stepped onto the ground, she turned and told Akaningu that her feet were cold. The demon woman apologized and said she would take care of it. She prepared a flame attack and set ablaze from the store. Meanwhile, the rest of the servants were still rolling out the carpet. As soon as she entered the shop, the vendor greeted her as Leikoria. I thought her name was Renee. Guess we'll find out soon enough. She simply said she had heard the Gothic Lolita dress was being sold there, and she wanted to see it. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, the three were quietly watching. Chess immediately pointed out that, judging by her name, the girl belonged to the Leikoria family, which was a problem. Iso knew that this was one of the most noble families in the city. Meanwhile, Disaster remained silent. What our boy found strange was that a family like this usually never left the Golden District. So what were they doing here? The carpet was still being stretched out when the shopkeeper told her to follow him. In front of something covered with a cloth, he told her that this was what she was looking for. However, when he turned to look, she had stopped in place. The carpet had run out, and the servants apologized. Akatingu immediately cursed them out, demanding to know how they dared not bring enough golden carpet. She declared this to be a severe mistake to the servants of the Korea family, and that she had no idea what to do about it. Man, the guy was sweating bullets. He had already drawn his blade as if they were about to put an end to their suffering. The two of them screamed that they would make the sacrifice of the heart, but before they could, their blades disintegrated. The other servant, named Shinku, had activated the Buddha's forgiveness technique. One of the servants thanked him, but was immediately struck in the back, causing both of them to collapse in agony. There they lay, unmoving, as Shinku told her to proceed in peace. Man, was all this really necessary? The girl walked over them like they were stepping stones. Chess even asked if every noble in the center was really this arrogant. But Izo was smiling, saying that this was a great opportunity. His friend wanted to know what he meant, and he said it was obvious. The perfect chance to pull off a kidnapping, someone who was supposed to be in the golden zone. The rat, however, said that killing heroes sounded way less dangerous than kidnapping a member of one of the most powerful families. Izo insisted, saying that this was how they were going to reclaim the glory that the Perseid family once had. But Chessie was still scared, pointing out that this entire city was built by the families of these people, so there was no doubt they would be hunted down until death. Meanwhile, Renee continued stepping over her servants until she was face to face with the dress. The shopkeeper said he was about to present a true work of art and pulled off a cloth. At the same time, Izo was teasing his friend, saying he was turning into a coward. That was when they both heard a scream. The so-called Gothic Lolita dress was completely destroyed, or maybe it just had a very peculiar design. The shopkeeper collapsed to the floor, while Renee demanded to know if this was truly the dress that the magical scissors had prepared for her. Akaringu had already drawn her blade, and Shinku declared that this time not even Buddha would be able to save them. Izo turned to his friend and asked if this was his doing. Chess apologized, saying that the shopkeeper had been really annoying, so he decided to have a little fun with something that seemed expensive. Meanwhile, Alpinia was trying to say that she also wanted to see what was going on. However, since she didn't know how to walk in heels, she ended up tripping, pushing our boy forward. At the same time, Renee was in front of the shopkeeper, ordering him to reveal who had done this. And right at that moment, our boy stumbled out of the dressing room. The shopkeeper immediately became convinced that it was his fault. Chess knew there was no way they were getting out of this one. Akaringu instantly grabbed Izo by the tie, lifted him, and asked if he was the one who had done this. Our boy pulled something from his sleeve and without hesitation admitted that yes, it was him. She was surprised by his response, while Chess couldn't understand why he had confessed so easily. Even the shopkeeper was confused, muttering that there was no way to save this lunatic now. Akaringu said she didn't like the way he was looking at her and was about to gouge his eye out, but then Renee ordered her to stop. She announced that she actually liked that dress. The shopkeeper and the big rat were both startled, wondering if this girl was insane. Akaringu protested, saying that the boy had destroyed her dress, so he needed to lose a finger. But Renee simply asked if she needed to repeat herself. At that, Akaringu immediately obeyed. She released our boy but slapped him across the face, telling him he better behave. As she straightened his tie, Ezo was already thinking to himself how cool it would be when the headlines tomorrow announced that this woman had been kidnapped. He just couldn't decide whether to use the dragon grenade or the torment grenade. But suddenly, Renee smiled and said that she knew exactly who he was and what he was trying to do. The moment she had stepped into this store, she had felt an overwhelming sense of danger. Izo was confused and surprised. She just wondered if his presence had really been detected that quickly. Renee took a slow step forward, never leaving the carpet, and stopped in front of him. She then stated that she knew he was just a mere intern at this store. After hearing she was going to visit, he had altered the dress and staged this whole little act just to get her attention. She was certain that all of this was because he wanted to be part of the Koryu family. Azo was completely lost. He had no idea what this crazy girl was talking about. But Renee kept going, saying that she admired his courage for risking his life just to get her attention. That was why if he got down on his knees and kissed her foot, she would accept him as her servant. Akatingu was furious. Well, actually, she wasn't furious. She was envious of the opportunity the boy had just received. Meanwhile, smiling, Renee was thinking to herself that when he bent down, if he seemed too eager, she didn't know whether to step on his head or kick him. But Aizo covered his nose and declared that he would never kiss a filthy foot. Both Chess and the shopkeeper were stunned. Akatingu wasn't sure if she should tear his head off. Meanwhile, the protagonist scoffed, saying it was ridiculous for someone from such a rich family to not even have shoes to walk around in. There was no way in hell he was going to kiss something that dirty. Chess was panicking, terrified that this lunatic wouldn't stop adding fuel to the fire. Renee held herself back. But then suddenly, she started crying. She whined that she put perfume on her feet every day so they weren't smelly. She lifted her hand, and Azo already had his plan ready. The moment her hand made contact, he would pull the grenade from his pocket, toss it into the room, and the kidnapping would begin. But before that could happen, someone emerged from behind the curtains. Our dear Alpina had grabbed Renee's wrist. Chess was shocked. He had no idea how this girl had moved so fast. In an instant, a Slash King flying, stopping right beside Alpina. It was Akatingu ordering her to take her filthy hand off the lady. Aizo realized that now things were really about to get complicated. Disaster just stood there, silent, while Renee seemed to be admiring her. She told Akatingu to put away her weapon. Akatingu asked why. Renee explained that she was certain the girl wasn't attacking her. She was protecting the boy. Aizo was impressed by how composed she was. Then Renee stated that she really liked that girl and wanted to take her. Akatingu didn't remember her boss having such preferences and wondered what kind of books she had been reading. Meanwhile, the shopkeeper had no idea what was going on today, but Renee was getting annoyed. She was thinking that these two were being incredibly arrogant. Meanwhile, Disaster stood there, still completely clueless about what was happening. Then the girl said that judging by the blonde's outfit, she clearly belonged to the nobility. But even so, when Renee set her eyes on something, she never gave up. So she simply asked for a price. Of course, Alpina was still completely confused. That was when Aizo spoke up, saying that she was the one who should be naming the price. Renee asked what he meant by that, and at that moment, he reached into his pocket. He then declared that from this moment on, she had been kidnapped by the #1 villain of the Golden City. Akatingu tried to draw her blade, but it was too late. The purple poison was already on the floor. The swordswoman and the servant lost all their strength in an instant. And in the blink of an eye, the girl had disappeared. Now tied to a chair, Aizo smirked and asked, "Where's the like on this video that helps Memorial make more juicy content for his viewers? Activate the cheeky little bell, and I'm out."